Hey, hello all, welcome back. It is 3:15. So before we call the task force hearing back into order, I will call in Parliamentarian Johnson so that a roll call may be established for quorum. Parliamentarian Johnson,
Yes, thank you. Chair Moore,
present.
Vice Chair Brown, Member Bradford, Member Grills,
Present.
Member Holder,
Present.
Member Jones Sawyer, Member Lewis,
Present.
Member Tamaki,
Present.
and Member Montgomery Stepp.
Here.
Madam Chair, there are 9 members on the task force. There are six members present. 5 are needed for a quorum, and a quorum has been reestablished.
Thank you. This meeting is called back into order now that a quorum has been established. The next item on the agenda is item number 20, which is number 21, potential action items scheduled for future meetings of the task force, with a discussion facilitated by myself and member Scott Lewis. And so before we get to the draft agendas for March and April that have been, drafted by the California DOJ, we wanted to take an opportunity, and Devon Scott Lewis, feel free to jump in, but we wanted to take an opportunity for task force members to relay any comments or questions based on the future hearing proposals that we submitted to the task force last month as regards to future topics and future locations, because it's necessary that we do get a vote soon on solidifying the location dates at least, because as we transition potentially into in-person meetings starting in April, in order for the task force members to organize and accommodate our schedules, those locations would have to be solidified sooner rather than later. And then as well, the topics as well. Member Scott Lewis, is there anything you wanted to add?
Not at the moment. I think it's for us to really know that we are representing what we think of as the kind of like geographic scope of the state. And it would be helpful given that the task force membership is largely representative of folks located across the state, that you all feel that there is significant or at least sufficient representation of various communities.
And just in case, oh, go ahead. Member Scott, Member Grills, you're recognized.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to find, my memory is not serving me, so I'm trying to find where the list is. Can you let me know? I'm looking in the January meeting materials, and our things are so voluminous and everything that we have. I'm not able to put my hands quickly on it.
I don't have the meeting materials pulled up per se because I have my own document for this document. I could ask California DOJ staff to pull up the document for the edification of you and members of the public. But if you have the meeting materials pulled up, you can do a control find, and you can look up, for instance, educational institutions and Black History Month panel, for instance. That'll probably take you right where you need to be. But
We're trying to find it to put it up. We're trying to find something to put up.
okay, great. I'll as the DOJ staff is helping with that administrative task, I'll just say straight out, right? So our in-person hearing is supposed to occur April. And then at our last hearing, we said that we had a quorum for April 13th and April 14th. And that meeting location is supposed to occur in San Francisco. And then we, so I'll just stop there.
More, were you asking me to jump in, or are you just stopping for communication?
See if you can post it to the screen. I mean, I can share my screen, but I'd rather not do that.
I'm working on it right now. Just give me a second.
Okay, great. But again, remember we had this conversation last month where members of the task force stated that they wanted, some time to think through what, topics or additional topics we could bring up into these future hearings as well. So I also wanted to leave time and space for folks on the task force to relay any observations that they had based on the proposal that we submitted last month as it relates to substantive topics and the locations.
Chair Moore, I have a comment.
Yeah, sure. Member Tamaki, you're recognized.
Thank you. So the April meeting, we have April 13th confirmed, and then it says also a quorum for April 14. And I'm wondering, just to give members a heads up, whether it makes sense to go ahead and block April 14th also. Unless it's a problem for task force members, we're easily filling up 2 days of hearing time. And so I'm wondering, especially in the pre-launch of the report and some of the other things that will come up, including part 2 and the progress of interactions with the economists, whether we should just say that the meeting in April is a 2-day meeting, or was that intentionally set as a 1-day meeting with another day as a possibility?
That's a good question. I'll take it to Member Javon Scott Lewis, but I will say that this proposal that we submitted was based on the idea that we would have had a community of eligibility vote decided by this month, which would have given more direction to the economic consultants leading up for the March meeting and then the April meeting. But that
I was just saying that the community of eligibility issue is a central question, no question, but had we even voted on that, been able to vote on that today, with the questions by the economists that when they posed them kind of had, I think we all had blank stares about what the responses should be, that it just indicated that we'll need to devote additional time, even having voted on eligibility question. So, and there are things within just the descendants of American slaves with respect to residency and these, issues of harm occurring in other states, but with descendants ending up in California. So I presume that that's going to be an ongoing discussion that is attached to the question of eligibility, which I presume we will vote on next month. I mean, there'll be, even after we vote, my point is, we'll be talking about all the details of what that means.
Thank you. That leads up to Member Javon Scott Lewis. You can take it from here in terms of that question.
Sure. And I think once we get the proposed schedule up, it'll be easier to answer some of these questions. But I think, so to answer your initial question, Don, yes, I think we should block both days. We should block both days because we don't yet know. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. We don't yet know. We haven't decided on exactly what we want to discuss over these coming meetings. And so we've had the privilege of having 2 days, and we've used them as you said, right, in our meetings thus far. it stands to reason that we would very well need to continue to use 2 days in our meetings, but we don't know. We have to decide together what those meetings will effectively comprise and be about, and if it would take 2 days. I think what Chair Moore and I discussed was that in this second part of our work, we would actually begin moving more towards an increasingly, discussion-oriented format of meeting, right? So we would have some presentation on the issues that are addressed, and then we would also have to devote significant time to discussing them, right? So we are moving into somewhat of a decision-making phase of the task force. But as Chair Moore mentioned, with the delay around the eligibility discussion, and that is really a two-part decision, right? Professor Spriggs earlier said that we were too abstract, and he's right, but there's an abstract component that we have to decide on, and then we have to have a more particularized discussion. So if we, for example, are thinking about a lineage-based or non-lineage-based format of eligibility, we then have to then decide within that decision, what are the qualifications, right? So Professor Spriggs asked us, well, when does the period of eligibility in relationship to California specifically begin? When does it end? These are the questions that the economists are asking for us to answer. And so we do need to devote some time to that. And so I think what will need to happen is we'll have to decide exactly how we are now meant to spend the March meeting and how much time it will take to accomplish that specific goal. And that will then determine how we move on from there. So the plan at the moment is for us in March to generally discuss criminal justice, etc. However, those 2 days of planned discussion around that topic, right? History of policing, mass incarceration, criminal justice, general, experiences of anti-Black hatred, that might need to be either condensed to give enough space for a robust discussion around eligibility and a vote on eligibility, or it might need to be moved back somewhat. So I think we have to now just move to the March discussion and decide from there. But what Chair Moore wants us to decide first is, are you all good with the places that we are proposing? That's the first issue. Are the locations that we are proposing for the in-person meetings suitable? And again, representative of where you think we should be holding our meetings. These are just generalized geographic areas. These aren't specific site locations yet. These are just cities for the moment.
Can we get the question for the DOJ? Can we get the full document? I'm only seeing a little part of it.
You're only seeing half of it? Okay, right.
Maybe it's my screen. I don't know.
Sure, I will. Can we extract that and post it in the moderator chat? And then while we're doing that, I do want to say one thing about the March meeting. Is it all right if I share something about from a perspective? I can wait until you all finish your discussion, but I do want to talk about prioritization of issues.
Well, I had one other question for you, Michael.
Sure.
We're moving into this new terrain of having in-person meetings starting in April. Is there any sort of mechanism if for some reason a task force member can't actually physically make it to the meeting? Is there any, is there any way to be a part of that meeting virtually, or is that not doable?
I think Doretha is an expert on this issue, but I'll speak to it, and I don't know if I get anything wrong or anything. We can also follow up with individuals who have issues come up. But essentially, in order for individuals to attend in a remote fashion, the location in which they attend from has to be open to the public and ADA accessible in order for them to be able to attend, and the attendance is via phone. Generally speaking, once we go to in-person meetings, the remote access contemplated in the statutes, and similar to what what is done in other what was done in other boards under the Bagley-Keene prior to the pandemic was call-in options, and the location from which members call in have to be posted along with the agenda on the posting date, and the location that is posted has to be open to the public. That's for the member to attend and vote and participate.
Okay.
I think that I can look back and refresh this and bring this into our March meeting and come back with a more detailed discussion. But I believe that in my sort of Bagley-Keene refresher that I gave when we thought we were going back to in-person meetings after the January meeting, I can give that refresher in the next meeting as well, just so everyone's familiar with it as we proceed. One thing that I wanted to add while we wait, I think we're gonna, DOJ staff is trying to extract it so that it can be posted for all of you to be able to sort of review it yourselves while it remains on the screen, is with regard to the March meeting, just to refresh your recollection, the March meeting subject matter is one of the components of report 1. And so we have, you'll see in the report as you review it, we've included the information that we've been getting from experts and witnesses who've testified in each of the meetings on the subject matter areas. And so the time that's allocated in the March meeting for witnesses and experts to testify is in order to further inform the report. You'll see that chapter of the draft report needs more work, needs more information in it, and that's going to come from the witnesses and the information that we elicit during the course of the March meeting. So I just will remind you that that time will be necessary for those witnesses to be able to give us all that information. And so if you take away from that, we start having to cut down on the number of witnesses. A lot of you have given us great suggestions, and we've been able to be in contact with witnesses because you've gotten us suggestions for witnesses ahead of time. So that's very helpful. But we'll have to, and that'll come up in the next segment when we talk about the agenda for the March meeting. It's now up there. But we do have a lot of room to cover. We have a lot of ground to cover in the March meeting already. I just throw that out there for your consideration.
Thank you for that, Attorney Newman. So returning back to the discussion on location topics, but I wanted to go back to Member Javon Scott Lewis in case you had another thought that was interceded.
No, I just want to hear what folks' views are on the locations, and then we can move through some of these other issues, subject matter, and then the March meeting agenda.
And is there a way to expand the document? Oh wait, or go back to the.
Or we can just, I've got the hard copy in front of me. If we're just approving the locations,
right?
Can we just recite them? In April, it's San Francisco. In July, it's Los Angeles. In September, it's Bakersfield with a trip to Allensworth. In November, it's Sacramento. In January, it's San Diego. In February, this is 2023, it's in Oakland. In April, it's Inglewood, and in June, it's Sacramento. So, Javon, you're asking basically, are those locations, is the breadth of locations sufficient to cover the state, is what you're saying. Is that right?
That's what I'm asking, yes. Or are there locations that members would have liked to have seen on the schedule? or substituted.
Okay, just providing. Oh, member Holder, you're recognized.
Oh, no, it looks like it's coming up on the chat. So now I'm getting to, sorry. I'm sorry. I'm just talking out loud.
Yeah,
Okay.
in the backstage chat, a member of the DOJ is pasting the locations for your reference.
So,
Member House.
yeah, so, I mean, I'm pretty much fine with the locations. What I did was a cross-check of those locations against the backdrop of where we have the largest percentage of Black residents across the state. And pretty much all of them could be covered, the largest populations rather, could be covered in the cities that are, or the locations that are listed in this draft. You know, there'll be a little bit more of a distance for some folks to travel than others, but it looks like, you know, we're hitting areas that would allow people who might want to attend to be able to be present.
Okay, yeah, and this conversation is just about locations, and whether they're, inclusive enough. The dates and things like that actually might be changed. For instance, the proposal says we're going to have a meeting in March, April, and then one in June. But there might. Sorry, go ahead.
It was July, I think.
Why?
Yeah.
Oh, July. Right, but things we might change it up a bit. So I just said that to say, for the purposes of this conversation, let's just hyper focus on the locations, and entertaining a motion related to the locations and their, geographic inclusivity.
Chair Moore,
Yes, Member Montgomery Stepp, you're recognized.
thank you. I know that folks still may be looking at the locations, but I'm happy to move the locations that are in the proposed public hearing schedule that is before us.
Is there a second?
I second.
So it has been properly moved and seconded that we will, the task force will utilize these locations to organize future hearings for the life of the task force. Is there any discussion on the matter? Comments, questions? Well, I will say a location that was not necessarily left out, but I don't think the Inland Empire per se is listed as a potential location. I think the closest location to the IE would be like somewhere like Los Angeles or even San Diego. And so I'm just pointing that out. And so I would hope that with the listening session, there's at least a couple of listening sessions that particularly services the Inland Empire area, because there is a significant Black population in the Inland Empire, namely like Rialto and San Bernardino.
Riverside.
Yeah, Riverside, thank you.
Right. There are a couple of the anchor organizations have roots in the Inland Empire, and their network covers the Inland Empire.
Okay, great. That works well. Are there any other questions or comments related to the motion on the floor? Okay, hearing no further discussion, I'll call Parliamentarian Johnson so that a roll call vote may be established on the motion, which is to adopt the locations in the proposal from the advisory committee as locations that we'll use for future hearings. Parliamentarian Johnson?
Chair Moore,
Aye.
Vice Chair Brown, Member Bradford, Member Grills,
Aye.
Member Holder,
Aye.
Member Jones Sawyer, Member Lewis,
Aye.
Member Tamaki,
Aye.
Member Montgomery Steppe.
Aye.
Madam Chair, there are 6 members voting. There were 6 ayes and 0 nays.
Thank you. There are 6 ayes and no nays, and so the motion carries as the ayes have it. Okay, so we're still in the same agenda item, but now that we have, the location solidified for the most part, we want to return back to if there's any comments, questions, or suggestions from the task force based on the proposal received since last month around substantive topics. And if not, we can just get along and go to the March draft agenda and start taking some action around that, and then the April draft agenda. Member Javon Scott Lewis, is there anything you want to add?
No, but I'm recognizing that Dr. Grills has something that she wants to say.
Thank you. So I know that, and I hear loud and clear that our agenda for March is pretty full. But in looking over the report section for education, chapter 6, and also going back and looking at the testimony that we had related to education, education was linked with something else, that it feels like we really haven't done justice to the topic of education. For example, the failure of the local control funding formula, the issues related to teacher quality and school finance, curriculum trauma. There's a long list, and we haven't touched on a lot of those things. And there are folks who are concerned that we haven't adequately, in their minds, also addressed education. And I'm thinking like there's a group that has quite an extensive set of connections, the Black Education Network. And so I'm wondering whether or not we could somehow fit a short panel, if nothing else, on education in the month of March, particularly since education is part of the school to prison pipeline, and we're dealing with criminal justice or the criminal legal system, the war on drugs and mass incarceration, along with the fact that particularly when you look at the education issues for incarcerated Black youth and for Black youth who are in the child welfare system and Black children who age out of the welfare system, TAY youth, transition age youth, their transition into the criminal justice system, it's almost a straight line. And we haven't really kind of dealt with that yet. So I'm just throwing that out there to see if it's a possibility, recognizing that we have a pretty full March agenda.
Yeah, I would say I initially, when we were coming up with this proposal, intended for, full panels on educational institutions from pre-K to 12th grade, right, and to collegiate and professional educational institutions to be a part of this month's hearing, actually in February. But I want to actually take it to Attorney Newman just to relay the conversation we had in terms of the rationale for taking that out of the agenda. I think, Attorney Newman, if you could speak to that, because I think there was something you were saying about future hearings.
Sure, absolutely, happy to. So, yeah, we were talking about trying to revisit education, I think a couple of months ago, and it was part of discussing the future meeting agenda schedule, because I think this has come up a couple of times, and both because our meetings have been chock full of information and witnesses. One of the things that I mentioned, and you all saw this in the report, is we did address education earlier on, and there is a fulsome section in our report on education, which we can build out without necessarily taking more testimony, but we can still schedule. You'll notice the head meeting schedule that Chair Moore and Member Scott Lewis put together actually doesn't have the maximum number of meetings. It only has, I believe, 8 meetings, which would give the task force the opportunity to schedule a whole own separate dedicated meeting that could address education issues as a 9th meeting, still having another 10th meeting under the statute as currently drafted in person. That would allow for a fulsome discussion of all of these education issues that have come up after the meeting in which we discussed education. So I suggested that as an option. The issue, I guess my question for you is the idea that you'd like to try to elicit more information to be included in report 1, or is it the context that Chair Moore and I were discussing it was looking at if there is a way, one of the components that AB 3121 talks about is other forms of reparations. So is the question looking at other forms of reparations impacting education, like forget the term, but at any rate, like education promises, supplemental education, compensatory education, other things that can and need to be done in order to correct and rectify the problems that people have suffered as a result of deficient education or biased education policies or things like that? Or is this more that you really do want something that is going to be incorporated into report 1 as part of the historical history? And that's really, so it's a 2-part question. And the reason I'm asking that question is because you see how full the March agenda is. And so I'm thinking to do what you're asking would be like another day of a meeting, or really cutting down on and revisiting the March agenda to allocate time so that you all are able to get the witnesses you want into the meeting on criminal justice issues.
So I think that there are things that can be added to the first report that don't have to wait on the expert witnesses. But I do think the expert witnesses would provide a deeper understanding of things and perhaps raise things that I may not know enough about, because, I'm not an educator, but I've done a fair amount of education-related research and work with community organizers who do campaigns on education reform. But I also know that kind of scheduling yet another meeting may be a bit much for folks. So I'm wondering if there's a middle road or a hybrid, if you will, and that might be to list, I'll do as best I can, and other task force members add things to the education section that seem to be missing. And then perhaps at least one of the witnesses in the March meeting could kind of at least lift up for everyone the role that education plays in these in the topics that we'll be discussing, because pretty much most of them, they have implications for how the numbers of Black folk end up in the prison system, end up under the consequences of the war on drugs, et cetera. So it's not changing the schedule, it's just making sure that at least one of the witnesses can provide the bridge between education and those other topics.
We can certainly do that. If you have witness suggestions, we can certainly do that, and we'll get to that in the next agenda, the next agenda item. We can change the name of the topic or however you'd like to frame it. We can certainly add that in, no problem.
If I may, Chair Moore.
Yeah, sure. You're recognized, Member Scott Lewis.
Thank you. So I agree with Member Grills, and I think we actually, the topic of education deserves, robust representation in this process. I was raising my hand earlier because I recall that earlier conversation being largely determined by the timeline around Report 1. And so it sounds like there's enough of a foundational kind of amount of information in the report around education that it's there, and that it can be built upon with relatively little. And I'm saying this, not doing the work that you all are doing, but I can imagine that whatever we do on a normal, right, kind of meeting around education can then work to supplement what's already written up, right? And so I would recommend that we actually look to utilizing the months of March, April, and May to address the 3 questions of eligibility, criminal justice, and education. Because we don't currently have a May meeting in the schedule, and then we can just push back, right? We can instead of we can push back things to late July, August for what would already what's already planned in the schedule. So that's my question to you, Michael, is that do you think it's feasible, say if we had in early May, right? And I know we have to approve the report, but I think if the task force approves a report, right, in April, with an understanding that, right, there is an expectation to supplement the discussion around education in the report in a meeting that comes in May on education, is it fine, and from a labor standpoint, for us to have the meeting around education, a proper meeting as we've had our meetings to this point, in early May, and have enough time for it to be, for whatever is introduced in that discussion to be incorporated by the June 1 release? Of Michael's face tells me no.
Yeah, I mean, we are taking a final vote in the April meeting, and then taking the report final and have to format it for publication. So I don't know that we have, I don't think we'll have the opportunity to add anything into the report from March on. We'll need to really be doubling down on finalizing it, getting everything in, site checking, all that stuff. So I think the March meeting really is the cutoff to meet the statutory deadline.
I think it's important to note that there are 2 things, right? One is a report and the service that the report provides, but then there's also these 2-day meetings, right? And what we do know is that people are more likely to tune into these 2-day meetings, right, than they are to necessarily go through and read, several hundred pages of a report. And so it is really important that we actually, in doing a service to the California public, actually have a presentation on the issue of education. Especially right now, I'm at UC Berkeley, and we're seeing what's happening with the kind of, what will be the consequences of, enrollment gaps in University of California schools. So it is an important issue that we, that certainly, deserves, significant attention. So I think, with that in mind, it is good for us to have, a proper meeting, even if it does come at the cost of some of the content of that meeting not showing up in the report. based upon your production timelines.
And just to be clear, just because it's not in report 1 doesn't mean it can't be in report 2, and there can't be suggestions, clarifications, or recommendations to the legislature. Report 2 will also be recommendations to the legislature, and we'll have some of the final recommendations. And having a standalone meeting, education may be an issue in which you members of the task force may think that there are special things that need to happen, special considerations, forms of reparations, or programs. And so that meeting may be the opportunity in which you really do a deep dive into education.
And if we do that, then would we keep the April meeting just one day?
Well, from my perspective, I'm hearing 3 things. One is obviously the March meeting is full agenda. Then there's still the lingering question of the discussion on eligibility, discussion and potential vote on eligibility, and then there's the question of education issues. And so we'll get to the March agenda, but I think we should have no problem adding a couple of witnesses on education to the March agenda if we want to talk about things like school to prison pipeline and that are interconnected, and even just general education things. So that should be definitely, we should be able to accommodate that. We, again, want all of your witnesses, so please send those. So I think that's March agenda, and that's separate from the question of, do you want to add another meeting on education? Should that be added in to May? Should it be added with the understanding that it wouldn't be able to be added to the report? Or should it be added in later on in the process as part of report 2 analysis? And then, like I said, the third question is, when are you all going to want to have a supplemental discussion? And I don't know if the suggestion was having the further discussion on eligibility is the second day of an April in-person meeting.
Thank you for that. So,
Chair Moore, I wonder if I
yes, Member Tamaki. Yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead.
So, on the issue of eligibility, there's some urgency for us to at least make a sufficient decision that the economists can get started. And, we had 1 hour devoted to this, and without, the economist discussion sort of highlighted how complicated it is. And so even if we had focused on making a decision today, there's all these open questions that they can't even get started until we address them. So, it's a bit of a showstopper, is what I'm saying, in terms of the economists being able to do their job. So I hate to bring this up, but is there any way we could add like a 3 to 4 hour session to at least make a sufficient decision on eligibility sometime in March that the economists can get going now that we've retained them? And there'll be lots of open questions beyond that, but I just heard a general sort of consensus about American descendants, descendants of American slavery being, in any event, a focus, and we have to focus on that in terms of a starting point, as people had said. So if I'm reading the task force right, maybe we could add a 3 or 4 hour session on that just to get them started. And I'm thinking out loud with you. Maybe it makes no sense at all, but I wanted to just throw that out there because I'm looking at the March agenda. And even if you shrink it, if you leave 1 hour for eligibility, I'm wondering if that's enough. and you'd have to bump quite a few of these witnesses on crucial topics on the criminal justice system. So the math is not adding up to me. I just think we need a block of time for task force members to each, speak their piece and at least resolve enough, not the whole thing, but at least enough for the economists to get started. Now, am I reading that wrong, or
No.
what's your sense of it?
Yeah, I agree. I think that the significant chunk of time of the March meeting has to be dedicated to eligibility and the scope of work. And perhaps what we can do is, we have two panels. It looks like we have two panels currently scheduled for March on criminal justice. Maybe we move one of those panels to April, and also at that time deal with education issues like the school to prison pipeline. But the March agenda is going to have. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I wanted to clarify. There's 4 panels scheduled for March. So
Okay.
There's a panel on history of policing, history of war on drugs, and the next day criminal justice system, and then anti-Black bias or hate crimes. But Javon Scott Lewis and I both discussed about potentially condensing each of those 2 into like 1 for each day, just to show that we were kind of in alignment with what you're saying. And we also discussed that we would need to have more than 1 hour to discuss the community of eligibility on the more abstract level, but then also on the more granular level. Whether we need 3 hours versus 2, I don't know, but definitely more than an hour. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Member Holder. Go ahead.
I think that's on point. I'm in agreement with that.
Member Grills, you're recognized.
Yeah, and I think also to give us back some time, that I don't need an entire hour to do the community engagement. I think we can give that hour to the discussion of the community of eligibility, and I can simply do a bulleted kind of update with 5 minutes to explain it. The other thing too is that in order for us to fully have that conversation in March, it would be helpful if the economists could send us a list of the kinds of things that we need to be able to answer for them. We should have gotten that way back when. So, so we definitely cannot have that conversation without knowing that.
And we can remove this, I think, the subpoena update from the March meeting, given how packed it is.
Yeah.
I'll just jump in real quick. I was going to ask the same thing that Member Grills asked, and even if we could have, even once we get here, a slide or 2 that can help us frame our conversation around some of those questions that they asked. I think it would just, I will speak for myself, it would help me think through, in addition to the questions ahead of time, just something here to help us stay on track.
Okay, thank you for that. So what I'm hearing, and Member Javon Scott Lewis, you can follow up. For the March hearing, we would have an extended discussion on eligibility. We would also have a condensed version of a discussion or panels on the criminal legal system, which will include anti-Black hate crimes, the war on drugs, the history of policing, and the criminal legal system, including the school to prison pipeline. It would just be a condensed version. And then we would also try to fit in a panel on educational institutions. So in essence, for March, and then we would drop off or limit the time of the community engagement update and then take out the subpoena power update. So essentially, or in summary, the March hearing would include extended a time to talk about eligibility, condensed panels for the criminal legal system substantive topics, and then adding a panel on educational institutions. Is that right?
That sounds right. I think I'd like to, sorry, apologies.
Can we eliminate the dictionary update?
Yes, you've already voted on it and resolved the question. So that can definitely be limited.
Yeah, sorry, my mic is messing up. Member Lewis?
Yes, thank you. So in line with what you're proposing, I would like to just, state more definitively that for the March 2-day meetings, day one of the March meeting would be effectively wholly devoted towards the eligibility question at the broader level, right? Meaning defining the community of eligibility, and then responding in a second session more specifically to the economist's requests. I mean, Professor Spriggs today gave us a whole host of very precise questions, as did Dr. Campbell. And so I think, we would need to actually have a couple of hours just addressing those precise questions. And so what that would mean then is that the second day would be a condensed criminal justice session, right? Chair Moore suggested the combining or the collapsing of the 4 categories into 2, which we can do in one day. And then I think, given that the April, if you go back to the longer schedule, given that the April meeting currently has as two topics, right? The final report approval and the topic of educating the California public. It seems like that's also an appropriate time to then have the discussion around education. For me, as I said earlier, it's more important that we have a proper discussion than prioritizing the production schedule of the report. Mr. Newman said also that the topics that we discuss at any point can show up in the second report, which I think is appropriate. And so that's what I would propose. We need a whole day on eligibility. We really can't do anything less than that.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. All right. Are there any other comments or questions based on what we discussed? If not, I'd also like to entertain a motion related to what we've discussed so far.
I have a question, a clarifying question.
Yes.
So for Member Lewis, in the vision for day one, I hear 2 components, and I'm wondering, because it's important for us to try to nail some of this down in terms of getting witnesses. So is the vision for day one of the March meeting that it would be witnesses? For example, I know we had some witnesses that we've been working on for this meeting on legal issues, some of the legal issues, some of the other threshold issues. I think during today's meeting, there's been some requests about genealogists or some discussion around, I know, I think Lewis Gates was mentioned before. And so having some witnesses on those topics, and then having the experts consult, and then having a discussion and a potential vote, or are you thinking about doing it, having the vote first and then all those?
Yeah, I'm talking about the voting the time to the discussion to getting the decision made. I would worry. I think what we do have to respond to are, what are the issues that the members who voted to delay the vote still need? What are the outstanding issues that they might need clarification on? And so, if they want to speak to those issues now, then we might devise a plan of getting answers or, finding experts who can respond to those precise issues. But in my view, we need to focus as much time as we can on actually discussing and then deciding.
So that would look like a full day of us discussing and maybe inviting these experts around the question, and then the decision will come towards the end of the day, as opposed to today where it was at the beginning, or supposed to be at the beginning.
Well, what I'm proposing is that there is a two-part issue with the question of the community of eligibility. One is deciding on who the community of eligibility is, which is what we were supposed to do today. And then the second part is then deciding how to qualify how we expect to provide a scope of work on that decision, based upon that decision, to the economists. And so in that first day of the March meeting, the first half of that would be us deciding on the community of eligibility. The second half of that first day would be us coming up with very precise prescriptions to provide to the economic experts as guidance for how they should go about the work of accounting for reparations for this community of eligibility.
Thank you for that clarification. I guess my only follow-up question, and maybe it's posed to the people who voted to delay the vote, what outstanding information is needed to help inform a potential vote for March? What type of experts or people we would want to invite to help inform the conversation? And, if we're trying to invite folks to help, those folks who voted to delay to get a better, more informed decision, where in the March meeting on that first day would those speakers be placed? Or, will it just be a replication of what we did today and we're just discussing amongst ourselves based on, I don't know, research that we do outside of the meeting?
Well, it was.
Attorney Newman asked the same question that I did. Sorry, Member Grills?
Yeah, so first to Member Lewis's question about those of us who voted no, what is it that we are still needing to know? It's the same as what I said this morning.
That's my question, sorry.
Huh?
I think that was my question. I don't know. I don't think Member Scott Lewis said that, but if he did, I'm sorry. I think that was.
He said it just now when he was speaking. He wanted to know from the folks who said no, who voted no, what was that based on? I mean, what is it that we still are needing to know? And that then speaks directly to what we need to hear and when in reference to the March meeting. So, so for me, the things included from people who are experts in this, how easy or difficult is it to do lineage determination? And what happens to those who cannot determine their lineage? And then about how many people might we be leaving out? Because this could become an unintended consequence. Mind you, we're also talking about, and I think we talked about a tiered approach, a layered approach, that the first and foremost primary concern would be descendants. I don't think anybody is questioning that. It's what happens for the rest of the folks. And so that then raises the other question for me, which is, really how many Black immigrants are we actually talking about in California, and over what periods of time? And then what happens if they are included? How does that harm the descendants in terms of any kind of reparations that are provided? And then what happens if you're, are we going to go down this rabbit hole of determining who's Black enough and non-immigrant enough, right? So, if you're from mixed parentage, your mom was, African American and dad is from Jamaica, what does that mean? And then the other thing is, what do we do for folks? Because the harms are not just during the period of enslavement, but having to do with the legacy of enslavement. What do we do in situations where all Black people were harmed, like running a freeway through someone's neighborhood and they lost their homes? What do we do? And Professor Spriggs raised that question as well. What do we do with those folks? We say, okay, you're a direct descendant, and so the harm done to you gets acknowledged and repaired. You actually didn't, you lived here for 2 or 3 generations, but you immigrated in, so you're not included in the reparations. I just would like some clarity on those kinds of things. And the last part is, and this was again raised by Professor Spriggs, but I think it's one that we really need to grapple with. And I don't know if I have to go back and look at the information, but what is our starting point? We need to figure out these. We need to figure out these kinds of parameters. Are we talking about when California entered into the Union? Are we talking about when Black folks were still coming here and being disrespected and abused and oppressed prior to California entering? So how do we decide that? I personally don't want to just arbitrarily pick a date and say, okay, it would be on this date. What am I basing that on?
Madam Chair.
Yes, Vice Chair Brown. Member Grills, were you finished? Just making sure.
Yes.
Yes, Vice Chair Brown, you're recognized.
I repeat again my position. If we're to be a deliberative body for the good of the people, as mature adults, we ought to be able to set a date, the same as we do on our jobs, the same as we do with projects that we may be contracted to do. And I just don't think that we are to this task. They're not even setting a date. And you know what that sounds like? Doing nothing.
You're muted.
Go ahead, you're recognized.
Oh, thank you, Chair Moore. So what kind of concerned me was, our 2 legislators whose responsibility is to translate these recommendations into legislation, saying we just need more time to discuss this. And I would like to get their input. Maybe they mirror some of the things that Member Grills just said. Maybe not, but maybe, again, respecting Bagley-Keene, maybe that's something that the DOJ or perhaps the chair, without violating Bagley-Keene, could ask them. But I'm sure as legislators, professional people involved in how policy becomes law in legislation, if they're saying we need more time, that's a big deal, more than an hour. So I think that was part of it. Senator Bradford is on, so it would be good to hear from him. And the Assemblyman Joan Sawyer talking about stopping the continuing harm, which she was talking about contemporary harms that affect everyone with black skin, is to quote him. I think it sounded like he needed more time to mull that over as a legislator. So if there could be information coming back from Assemblyman Joan Sawyer, that would also be helpful, I think.
Thank you for that. Sorry, was that Parliamentarian Johnson?
Yes, I just wanted to ask if you will, if you want to move the agenda forward, ask for a motion on the matter that's before you and get a second. Because I'm not
Okay.
clear. Yeah, because that's where you left off at.
Yes, so there were still some outstanding questions that people had, and I think Member Tamaki wanted to hear from some of the legislators on the task force. But to your point, Parliamentarian Johnson, I am opening the space to entertain a motion for what's been discussed thus far in terms of the schedule for future meetings of the task force. Member Bradford, are you trying to speak?
I apologize. I was on a plane, so are you guys going to go over that schedule just real briefly? Don't have to go in detail. Just curious on the next scheduled meetings.
Yeah, just a brief summary. What we've, in terms of consensus, what I think we've heard so far is that we'll have a March meeting where the first day will be solely dedicated to issues surrounding eligibility, where we'll discuss on the more abstract and take a vote on who should be eligible for reparations on the more abstract level, and then also have discussions on the more granular aspects of eligibility, utilizing the questions posed by the economic consultants today. And then on the second day, we will have a condensed version of our panels on the criminal legal system, which will include discussions on the history of policing, anti-Black bias or hate crimes, and the war on drugs, and the school to prison pipeline. And then in April, Jovan, do you want to talk about that, the April one?
Yeah, so thank you, Chair Moore. So that's the idea for the March meeting, and in the April meeting, we would Member Grills earlier mentioned that we haven't, and correctly so, mentioned that we haven't given enough attention to the issue of education in our meetings, and so we would be focusing our April meeting on the issue of education, as well as finalizing the draft of Report 1 and discussing the topic of how to educate the California public on our efforts.
Right.
Thank you.
No problem. So yeah, also leaving space to entertain a motion based on what we've heard so far. But I think the question is still outstanding in terms of for the folks who voted to delay the vote. What I think Member Grills kind of touched upon it. What type of information would be helpful to assist in folks to coming into a more informed decision, or what type of, more specifically, what type of witnesses, whether expert or personal, would be helpful to help guide the discussion.
Well, I'll respond. I think what Dr. Grills touched upon earlier today, kind of like a first tier, a second tier, and then a more granular identification of those folks who are in first, and then those individuals who are from the remnants of slavery here. So I thought someone had spelled those steps out, and I thought it was like a 3-level step. That's kind of like the fairest approach right now, I think. So if I'm misquoting that right now, please correct me. But that's what I thought someone had suggested earlier today. And I'm sorry, I have been in and out of this today based on session and travel and everything. So I apologize.
Thank you for that. I think that type of discussion will have to be for March. The question was really, for folks who decided to delay the vote, what type of information, not necessarily what you were speaking to, Bradford, but what type of information or what types of people outside the task force would you want to hear from to help you come to an informed decision when it is time to vote? That was the question.
I got it. And I think we've had great witnesses. I just think, just like the experts we saw today on, we just got to better refine it. That's all. I think that was my unreadiness, not based on information, but better defining, narrowing it down to who's entitled and, from there. But I think, I'm not saying I've heard enough, because everything I'm hearing is just very informative, very educational, but I don't have anyone in particular that I would need to hear from right off the top of my head. I just think we as a task force just has to drill down a little more on what we want to do and who we want to identify as eligible for reparations. That was my unreadiness.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll just say, I think it would be interesting if since we did vote to delay and we will have a whole day, it would be helpful to invite, genealogists or genealogy societies to help inform the conversation about the lineage-based question, even DA companies for folks who are in the system. That could be helpful as well. Well, we'll see, depending on their expertise. We don't know so far. And even people who speak to the concepts of delineation or disaggregation. I think there's two sociologists from Princeton University that wrote a book called, I think it was, I forgot what it's called, but essentially it's talking about, sorry, I'm going to pull it up. It's by Taji Hamilton, and it's called Immigration and the Remaking of Black America. So I think it would be important to invite scholars, sociologists like Taji Hamilton from Princeton University, who dedicate their lives' work to these type of conversations, that also come to the task force if they're free and able to assist with the conversation. But again, I'm conscious of time, and it's 4:30. So again, opening the floor to entertain a motion based on what we've talked about thus far in terms of content for the March and April meetings. Just leave it there.
I'll make a motion. I move that the March meeting have the first day devoted to the question of eligibility and coming to a vote, and that the second day be devoted to the question of criminal justice, as outlined in the proposal.
There's a second.
I second.
So it has been properly moved and seconded that the March meeting, the first day will be dedicated to eligibility, and then the second day will be dedicated to criminal justice as outlined in the proposal. Is there any discussion on the matter? Member Lewis.
Yeah, so my only point is that, while I'm happy for members to have, further testimony to help clarify the issue, I wanted to make sure that we don't occupy the entire day with testimony and leave ourselves without adequate time for decision, which will inevitably require some discussion, maybe even debate. I'm a bit wary that we could easily take up all of the time on the day with testimonies by genealogists, etc., and not have time to come to a decision.
Are you making a recommendation or just kind of making your concern? known.
I'm stating my concern. I know that the DOJ and the chair and vice chair, coordinate the slate of speakers on the day, and so I'm just stating that as a note, to be very conservative sharing my preference for you all to be very conservative with how many people you have show up on the day, in the risk that it will take away time from the task force having adequate opportunity to discuss and to decide.
If I
Thank
may,
you. Attorney Newman, go ahead. Yeah, you're
sure,
recognized.
just to clarify the direction from the task force. So, Member Lewis, you're talking about essentially something like sort of the morning being cabined off for experts and the entire afternoon blocked off for an open discussion about this issue, something like that? Or are you thinking, it sounds like what I was interpreting you was saying is the lunch break being the demarcation for the day and the afternoon being the discussion and action. But I want to make sure that we have an understanding of this, because we will have to go back from here and redraft the agenda and then circulate it. So as specific as you can be about your
Sure.
thoughts.
So in my view, based upon what we have right now as a March agenda, the first day, we have public comment ending at 10:05. Approval of the meetings from 10:05 to 10:10. Right now we have witness panel from 10:10 to 12:20. I would suggest that we have whichever experts we're asking to come testify, they have an hour. Limit that to an hour. And then, so from 11 o'clock onwards, even before lunch, we move to the discussion on eligibility.
Okay, thank you for that.
And then, as was stated, we could, there are issues later on in the agendas that can be moved and removed as well. The subpoena request, the dictionary updates, so the issues that would come up on the latter half of day one, according to the current schedule, meaning the community engagement plan update, the presentation scope of work, etc. Those can be moved to day two. I just want to make sure that we have the time to come to a decision and to, not just come to a decision, but to very clearly provide the economic experts with, very clear guidance about what the scope of work needs to be. And that relies upon, a definitive understanding of the community eligibility.
Are there any other comments or questions related to the motion on the floor?
Just a comment. I think that makes sense to me. We've got to have time for discussion.
Thank you for that. Any other comments or questions? Okay, hearing no further discussion or comment, I'll restate the motion. So the motion on the floor is for the March meeting day one to be solely dedicated to issues of eligibility. And the second day will be on criminal justice, and then also taking in Jovan's contribution that, any people that we invite to weigh in on the idea of eligibility have no more than an hour, so that the task force has significant enough time to discuss amongst ourselves and take a vote. Okay, so Parliamentarian Johnson, without further ado, if you may establish a roll call vote, please.
Yes, I will. Thank you. Chair Moore?
Aye.
Chair Moore votes aye. Vice Chair Brown?
Aye.
Vice Chair Brown votes aye. Member Bradford?
Aye.
Member Bradford votes aye. Member Grills?
Aye.
Member Grills votes aye. Member Holder?
Aye.
Member Holder votes aye. Member John Sawyer? Member Lewis?
Aye.
Member Lewis votes aye. Member Tamaki?
Aye.
Member Tamaki votes aye. Member Montgomery Steppe?
Aye.
Member Montgomery Steppe votes aye. Madam Chair, There are 8 members voting. There were 8 ayes and 0 nays.
Thank you. So there are 8 ayes and 0 nays, and so the motion carries as the ayes have it. So the March meeting, the first day will be dedicated to eligibility, and the second day will be dedicated to issues surrounding the criminal legal system. I also wanted to bring up the concept of public comment for March, because as we all heard, right, there were over 27 comments that we weren't able to get through given the time constraints. And so I just wanted to pose a question to the task force and also provide space an opportunity to entertain a motion to extend the public comment period for the March meeting from 1 hour maybe to 2 hours, and then we'll have like the experts speak for an hour, and then we'll have a discussion amongst the task force probably for like an hour before lunch, and then once we come back from lunch, we'll have the whole afternoon to discuss. So again, I'm just bringing up the idea of the potential of extending public comment given the high interest in this topic from various different perspectives, I should note. Is there anyone fundamentally opposed to extending public comment at all?
I'm not
Or
opposed.
is there anyone like emphatically in favor where they would want to entertain a motion?
I'm just concerned that we have enough time to actually get through this. It's a gating issue, centerpiece of the task force work, and it's urgent because of the need for the economists to get going. At least that's how I read it. So I just want to make sure that we have enough time to get through it. I mean, for example, I would be fine with the session starting an hour earlier instead of 8 o'clock, but we just need enough time to get to the issue of eligibility. So I don't think anybody wants to cut off public comment or reduce it. We want to hear everybody, but we can't do our job if we don't get through the issue of eligibility. And so, unless I'm misinterpreting you, Chair Moore, if we extend public comment and then end up not having enough time to vote and make a decision and to get it extended again, I don't think that helps us.
And I might add, maybe instead of extending it for an hour, maybe a half hour, and take Mr. Tamaki's suggestion, starting an hour earlier and just extend it for a half hour.
Okay, yeah. So again, just providing space and opportunity for us to discuss this and entertain a motion on that. I'm totally happy with starting an hour earlier, taking it 30 minutes, an additional 30 minutes on top of the hour. I'm flexible. I just think this is an important issue, and I think there's people on all sides of the argument that want to be heard. I don't know who those 27 people were or what they were going to say. But the fact that there were 27 people waiting, I think, is significant.
I agree.
Can I make a motion then?
Sure, yes, Member Grills.
I move that we extend the public comment by an additional 30 minutes to try to accommodate as many people as possible to share, and that therefore we need to start the meeting 30 minutes early to add that to the agenda, or to allow that into the agenda.
So moved. Second.
Okay, so it has been properly moved and seconded that the March meeting will start at 8:30 a.m. instead of 9 a.m. to allow for 30 more additional minutes of public comment. Is there any discussion on the matter? Hearing no further discussion, I'll cue Parliamentarian Johnson so that a roll call vote may be established.
Thank you. Madam Chair,
Aye.
Vice Chair Brown,
Aye.
Member Bradford,
Aye.
Member Grills,
Aye.
Member Holder, Member Jones Sawyer, Member Lewis,
Aye.
Member Tamaki,
Aye.
Member Montgomery Steppe,
Aye.
Madam Chair, there were 7 members voting. There were 7 ayes and 0 nays.
Thank you. There are 7 ayes and 0 nays, and so the motion carries as the ayes have it. So the public comment period for day 1 of the March meeting will occur starting promptly at 8:30, 30 minutes in advance. But day 2 will stay the same. It'll start at 9 a.m. and end at 10 a.m. Thank you. Okay, so the next, thank you so much, Member Scott Lewis, for your assistance in facilitating the conversation for agenda item 21. So we will move towards agenda item 22, potential action item agenda for next meetings. And so this part of the discussion is for any additional things we wanted to think about in terms of adding to the March meeting, but I doubt that that'll be the case because of how truncated it has to be. And then also a discussion for ratifying the April agenda, I believe. So, Member Scott Lewis, if you could, since we already did this, but can remind folks for what's on the agenda for the April meeting. So, of course, we talked about in this meeting a small or short panel on educational institutions, but then the remainder of the April meeting would be around, discussing the report and making a final vote on the report. Is there anything else to add on that? And making reference to the draft April agenda that the DOJ published in the meeting materials and sent to the task force some weeks ago.
And just to jump in one other thing on that is, so right now it is scheduled for the April meeting. I think questions that need to be answered is, do we want to leave it at 1 day? We obviously are still looking for a location. You previously voted as a task force that if the governor extends the emergency order before the meeting is held, that the Department of Justice will convert the meeting into a virtual meeting to allow for the meeting to be held virtually rather than in person. And just to follow up, we will then follow up with you all with regard to travel and everything between now and the April meeting. So I think the questions that need to be answered are, do we want to plan for the April meeting to be a 1-day meeting or a 2-day meeting? And just a reconfirmation if anybody wants to reconsider the question of whether it should be converted from in-person to remote if the governor extends the emergency order.
Thank you for that. So we can deal with the days first and then go to the location. So are there any, we already kind of also talked about this, but any task force members, emphatically that the meeting should be 2 days or 1 day, feel free to make your comments known.
Well, if it's a travel meeting and you're meeting in person, I think it should be 2 days. But if it's going to be remote, I think 1 day is fine. But if it's travel, I think 2 days is always more accommodating for folks.
Okay, so we can deal with the location question first then, since it might inform the days. So yes, as Attorney Newman stated, we're planning on having our first in-person meeting in April in San Francisco, but Attorney Newman spoke to the point that a specific location hasn't been found yet. Opening up the discussion, our task force members, do we want to have an in-person meeting in April, or do we want to continue to be remote if Governor Newsom's order isn't lifted? But again, Attorney Newman, if he lifts order, we have no choice, right? We have to meet in person. Is that correct?
That is correct. If things are as they stand, the task force will have to meet in person. And going back to the question that I received earlier, if anybody is unable to travel and will be attending by phone, we'll need to know at least 10 days in advance so we can notice the date, the location from which a person is going to be calling in by phone. And that location has to be open to the public. But otherwise, we will figure out a location. We're still working on figuring out a location. We'll set that location. It'll be part of the agenda, and we will proceed in person. It's only if the governor extends the emergency order allowing for virtual meetings that you all previously decided if that order is extended and the task force has an option of choosing in person versus remote, the task force collectively voted to remain remote. You're muted, Dawn, if you're talking.
Can I make a comment, please?
Yeah, sure. You're
Thank you.
recognized, Member Tamaki.
Thank you. So I think our decision why would it be any different? I asked this question to Reggie Jones Sawyer as what is the California government doing? What's the best practice in terms of following the science? And he said, well, we don't want to have the reputation of being a spreader, a pandemic spreader. And so on that basis, everybody agreed that if the governor extended the order, it must be based upon best practice in science and that we would go virtual. And if there's a reason to change it for this meeting coming up, let's discuss that. But if there isn't a reason, to me, the decision should be the same.
Okay, and so that decision, just to reiterate, is in alignment with what Member Reggie Jones Sawyer stated. We're advocating that we stay remote if we're able to, right? But if not, we will have to meet in person.
Correct. And if we stay remote, there's a reason for it, and that is the governor has seen fit to extend the order. So, and that would be because of a health issue. I think that's, as I understood it, that's the reasoning.
Yeah, that's great. I think there's still, it doesn't necessarily resolve the points that Bradford was speaking to. So if we're in person, are we advocating for a 2-day meeting as opposed to if it's remote, we're only advocating for a 1-day meeting? Right, that is also something in the air. And then also Attorney Newman, it may not even be relevant or helpful for this discussion right now, but just putting it out there in terms of, has there been any leads in terms of locations, particularly in San Francisco? but that's not necessarily relevant right now.
I wonder, Chair Moore, can we book the 2 days with the option to go back to 1 if necessary? I just think that it's been our, what we found is we actually need these 2 days for these meetings. I'd be happy if we don't, but if people, don't reserve that second day, then that's gone, and we are stuck with being pinched to a 1-day meeting. So if the task force is not ready to commit to 2 days, can we at least reserve that time so it's marked out on everyone's schedule?
I think that sounds good. Reserving the 2 days just to be on the safe side. And then I know that the draft agenda that the task force sent out for April is just based on a 1-day schedule. So then I would just recommend that Scott Lewis and I, as members of the advisory committee on proposing meetings for future hearings, we'll go back into the drawing board and try to get that expanded to a 2-day meeting proposal that we can present at the March meeting. Member Scott Lewis, you're recognized.
Yeah, thank you. What I was proposing earlier for April was that we would then have a day on the issue of education, as Member Grills brought up earlier, and then we would spend the second day basically following what the current schedule is asking for, which is the discussion on the final approval of the report, and then a discussion on how to then use the report to educate the California public. So as I see it, April would still require a 2-day meeting. 1 day to accommodate the education panels as mentioned by Member Grills, and then the second day to because we're required to finally approve the first report in April, and then to discuss educating the California public.
Okay,
which
great.
was set forth
Thank you for
in 3121. So that second requirement of discussing how to educate the California public was set forth in the bill. So we do have to discuss that.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you for that reminder. So now we can just open the floor to entertain a motion for the April hearing. Restate what you said if you want.
Okay, yeah, I move that the April meeting be a 2-day meeting, with day 1 being a discussion on the issue of education and educational disparities in the state of California, and with day 2 being the approval of report 1 and the discussion around educating the California public.
Second.
Chair Moore, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So it has been properly moved and seconded that the first day of the April hearing will be on education, and then the second day would be based on the current schedule sent out, or in other words, voting on draft report 1, and then also, sorry, what was it again? Draft report 1. Oh yeah, and then also discussing ways to educate the California public as laid out in the bill text. So, is there any discussion on the matter? Okay, here for the discussion, I'd like to cue parliamentarian for a roll call vote.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chair Moore?
Aye.
Chair Moore votes aye. Vice Chair Brown? Member Bradford?
Aye.
Member Bradford votes aye. Member Grills?
Aye.
Member Grills votes aye. Member Holder? Member Jones Sawyer? Member Lewis?
Aye.
Member Lewis votes aye. Member Tamaki?
Aye.
Member Tamaki votes aye. Members Montgomery Stepp.
Aye.
Member Montgomery Stepp votes aye. Madam Chair, there,
And Vice Chair Brown, aye.
thank you. Vice Chair Brown. Vice Chair Brown votes aye. Madam Chair, there were 7 members voting. There were 7 ayes and 0 nays.
Thank you. There are 7 ayes and 0 nays. The ayes have it and the motion carries. So for the April meeting, the first day will be on education, and the second day will be on voting for the draft report approval, and then also discussing ways to educate the California public as outlined in AB 3121. Great. So now we have our March and April meetings pretty much solidified, and we'll be awaiting information from Governor Newsom as it relates to his order. Okay, so the next item on the, well, before we go to that agenda, I wanted to raise a point about the communication firms, because we, contracted with them, I think, since December, maybe. But we haven't heard from them at all. Like, they haven't introduced themselves to the task force. We're not sure what they're doing in terms of work and in terms of outreach. I think that's alarming. And so I wanted to place on the agenda, if there's time for March, some time, and if there is no time for March, at least April, the latest, for these communication firms to communicate to the task force and to the public what their plans are in efforts to get the word out on this historic effort.
Yes,
And
I'm wrong.
so,
Yes, it has. It's right here. I got it.
yeah. So, yeah, I just wanted to make that clear. Attorney Newman, is that something that we could potentially set up if we entertain a motion and it succeeds for March or April?
So I thought that part of the agenda for April specifically dealt with the plan and process for communicating with and educating the public. And I know Dr. Grills is back on. So I'm not exactly clear. Are you asking to add an agenda item, or are you telling us to add an agenda item that would have the communications professionals that are part of the Bunch Center agreement come before the task force and outline their work or their credentials? And is that something you want added, I suppose, this would be added to the second day of the March meeting, which is pretty packed, or added on to the April agenda as an additional component of the education of the public and communication about the report discussion?
I would say the second day of the March meeting, it could be brief, kind of similar to the presentation that Professor Stoll and the Anchor organization gave yesterday. It was just a brief introduction and their plans and things like that. I think it's important to kind of get these communication firms on record, who they are and what they plan to do sooner rather than later. So do we need to do a motion on that, or is that just a directive I can say, can we, as part of the agenda for the second day of March, we invite them to speak?
I think that you all just set the agenda by vote for the March meeting previously. So I think, not unfortunately, but I think just in order to be clear, I think you do need to have a motion and add that, amending the vote you just took on the agenda.
That's correct.
Thanks.
Can't hear you.
Member Grills, would you be interested in entertaining a motion for that, since it's sort of in your purview in terms of leading the community engagement efforts?
Yes, absolutely. And just for the record, they were who the communications firms are was shared with the task force at the January meeting, as well as their
Yes.
basic framework. But I do agree that it's time to hear from them directly. And so I would like to make a motion that we add the communications firms to do an overview about who they are and what their communication strategy is for the task force.
Madam
And I
Chair,
will
may
second.
may I state that you want to amend the previous agenda that was passed by the board? Is that by the commission?
Okay. So I'd like to amend the agenda for the March meeting to include a presentation from the communications firms about who they are and what their communication strategy is for the task force.
Great. For
And
the
I'll second.
second. Thank you. So it's been properly moved and seconded to amend the March agenda to include a presentation from the communications firms on the second day of the March agenda so that they can introduce themselves and to provide an overview of their communication strategy to the task force and to the public. Are there any questions or discussion on the matter? Member Lewis, you are recognized.
Thank you. Given that the proposed date for the April meeting is only 2 weeks or so after the March meeting, I wonder if we would be willing to delay that presentation until the second day of the April meeting, given that that is when we will be discussing educating the California public. And it seemed at least thematically appropriate that we would hear from that group then. And we might be able to actually engage them with some planning and also give them some time maybe to kind of come up with something to present to us. That's my thought, especially given the fact that the second day of March is already so packed.
Yeah.
I do worry, that we would, do a disservice to a robust enough discussion around criminal justice.
Thank you.
So
That's a good point.
I tried to get my hand in there before Member Grills, advanced the motion.
Sorry.
No, I don't know. I just, once the motions get moving, pun intended, I don't know when to interject. So
I think member girls can withdraw the motion and then someone can withdraw the second and then we can start over.
Okay, I withdraw the motion.
And I withdraw the second.
Great, thank you.
I can restate it. Good. You want to do it? Okay.
no, please.
Okay. I'd like to make a motion that we amend. No, we're not amending anymore because we didn't vote on the April meeting. So I can just propose. Okay. So
We did on the April meeting, so we would amend the April meeting instead of the March meeting.
it's a long day. So I'd like to make a motion to amend the April meeting agenda to include a presentation by the communications firms about who they are and what their communication strategy will be.
Thank you. Is there a second?
A second.
So it has been properly moved and seconded that we will invite the communications firms to the second day of the April meeting so that they can introduce themselves and then also provide an analysis of their communication strategy. Is there a discussion on the matter? Hearing no further discussion, Parliamentarian Johnson, may you please establish a roll call vote, please? Thank you.
Yes. Chair Moore,
Aye.
Vice Chair Brown, Member Bradford, Member Grills,
Aye.
Member Holder, Member Jones Sawyer, Member Lewis,
Aye.
Member Tamaki,
Aye.
Member Montgomery Steppe,
Aye.
Madam Chair, there were 5 members voting, 5 ayes and 0 nays.
Thank you. There are 5 ayes and 0 nays, and the ayes have it, so the motion carries. We have voted to amend the April agenda to include a presentation from the 2 communications firms. Thank you so much. So now we're at the second to last item on the agenda. It's technically the last item, which is item number 23, potential action item, unfinished business. Is there any unfinished business? From my vantage, there isn't necessarily. We have everything queued up for March and April. But I want to provide the space for task force members and then also for Attorney Newman to interject for this portion of the agenda. Member Tamaki, you're recognized.
Thank you. So I'm asking Chair Moore and Jovan, Member Lewis, whether we plan to have a May meeting. And the reason I'm asking is everybody's calendars fill up fast. And so if the plan is to have a May meeting, it would help me anyway to know what those dates are going to be so I can lock them in. So have you thought about that, or what you're thinking?
Is that a question for me or?
Everybody really. And if the advisory committee hasn't thought about it, do other members have a thought? It's more challenging to get these dates locked in the longer we wait. So it's easier if we lock them in, at least for me. I don't know how it is for everybody else.
I think I would just want to make clear and set expectations that just again, April is when we need to finalize the report. So to the extent there's a May meeting, I don't want there to be any lingering expectations that we'd be able to take testimony in May and have that be in the report, nor that we'll have the report done for the May meeting, because once we finalize it after the April meeting and you all vote and we go final, it's going to take us all that time to format it and get it submitted. So I just want to make sure that's out there so you're well aware.
Member Lewis, did you want to add? We have discussed a May. Go ahead.
So let me just get the document up again. So Member Tamaki, in the agenda, the agenda item 21, which was a schedule of the proposed meetings, what we had was a meeting March and April, and then a break until July. However, I think that, given the need to kind of move things along, the September meeting, which would be the next substantive meeting, meaning that the July meeting would be a kind of the discussion of the report, but that doesn't really, I don't think, constitutes, a full meeting. The meeting that would follow, which, if you're looking at the schedule of proposed meetings in September 2022, would be our first discussion about the models of reparations that we might want to consider. Chair Moore and I discussed moving that up to May to kind of get the conversation moving along. And then that would mean us then taking, the June and July 2 months, and then restarting in August with what would on this current schedule be the topic of November 2022. And so that would give us the ability to actually add more meetings, because as Mr. Newman mentioned earlier, we do actually have, once we move to in-person meetings, we do have about 2 more slots that we can utilize. So if we move this up a little bit, that means then we actually have the opportunity in the calendar to utilize these two remaining slots. So this is just something that Camille and I Chair Moore and I just briefly discussed. And so, I'm not saying it's a proposal or a proper proposal yet. And maybe it's one that she and I can go away and think about a little bit more with some feedback from the task force today. But that is what we are considering as an alternative to what's presented to you in the current schedule.
Here more.
Attorney Newman, can you, sorry, was that member Montgomery Stepp? You're recognized.
Oh, okay, just real quick. Just a question. I guess it's a more procedural question, but can we check availability for May now and do a tentative kind of hold so that we're not losing those days? And I don't mean now in the meeting we have to make a motion, but well, maybe we do for the DOJ to tentatively send something out. I don't see anything wrong with that. And if we decide as a task force that we don't need that, then we can decide, in the next meeting or but that's what I would just suggest, because as Member Tamaki said, the calendars are ridiculous. So the sooner the better, and without making a full commitment.
Madam Chair, it sounds like you're planning to make a move to take an action, and this is not agendized. I mean, this is kind of your closing comments before you end the meeting. So it's not unfinished business.
Well, I would just
make a decision, or even though it's not permanent, it's still, you're asking them to make a tentative decision, which is still action.
I would just,
let
me jump in and just say real quick that I would run it by the chair, who still has some sort of authority, the chair and the vice chair, to check the pulse, or the DOJ, to direct the DOJ to just check the pulse of the committee. It does not have to be an action. I think the chair has that discretion.
That's cool. That's good. As long as everyone understands. I just didn't want anything to proceed beyond thinking about it, having Attorney Newman, check the schedule or whatever, but all informal.
Sure. Yes. Yeah. I get you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that I was essentially going to make the same statement or ask the same question as Member Montgomery Stepp. And to Attorney Newman, if we had any quorum dates established for May, and if not, for the DOJ staff to run a doodle poll or as soon as possible to make that happen.
Yeah, we can run a doodle. And when we come back for the March meeting, we can give you those dates on which you all respond and let us know your availability. So we'll run a doodle on May dates. Please send us your witnesses. And so the witnesses we're looking for are any suggestions for the day one of the March meeting, which is going to be genealogists or attorneys to testify in that 1 hour block on day one on eligibility, and then any witnesses for any of the 3 panels that have been discussed for day 2, which is criminal justice, I guess criminal justice / education, and I guess the third panel, which is the combination of hate crimes and bias and policing, is what it sounds like. We'll have to go back and look at those panels. But if everyone could send us your witnesses ASAP, we can start the process of confirming people and figuring out those panels.
Thank you. I would say I sent my witnesses to the DOJ, but then I also just outreach to all of them. And a few have already confirmed that they're interested and excited to participate. So Thomas Harvey, who is the executive, the state director of the Children's Defense Fund of California, has said that he's excited and appreciates the opportunity to testify. There's also Darius Young, and Thomas Harvey said that he wanted to testify around like the criminal legal system, juvenile justice system issues. Tasha Henneman on the school to prison pipeline, and then Darius Young on the school to prison pipeline as well. Putting that out there for the record. Okay, so that's good for unfinished business. Are there any other last comments or questions from the task force members? Okay, well, hearing no other comments or questions, thank you all for exhilarating Black History Month ceremony and second day of business, and looking forward to continuing this historic work in March. So thank you all very much and take care. This meeting is now adjourned.